Bishara is Jazeera senior political analyst. He joins me now in the studio to talk more about this. So, Marwan, the U.S. Secretary of State here in Qatar, the latest stop on his 9-nation tour of the Middle East. He's got his work cut out for him, hasn't he?
Absolutely. Too many challenges, and President Trump's recent declarations and previous declarations have left many in the region dumbfounded for answers as to what exactly is the U.S. policy in the region. And I think some of that was clarified. A lot of others was left not necessarily clarified. It remains ambiguous. But I guess you could say this is a process of sort, a work in progress, as it were. And certainly the Gulf region is an important one. And the resignation of Anthony Zinni the day Secretary Pompeo arrived in the region, of course, lit many red lights as to what exactly is the policy in the Gulf and vis-a-vis the so-called Middle East Strategic Alliance. Is this all failed or not? Well, we've heard from Secretary Pompeo that, in fact, this has not necessarily failed and that the process continues and the work in progress, as it were, also continues. And that's why, as Hashim just mentioned, that perhaps there is some movement in the Gulf as to the issue of finding a resolution to the crisis.
You mentioned there the resignation of Anthony Zinni, who was a key envoy in this dispute. He's the latest in several senior officials who've resigned. I read also as well that of the 9 nations that the Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State, is visiting, I believe only 5 of them have have U.S. ambassadors. So a lot of vacancies to fill there, and it does seem that he's really short-handed in the work that he has to do.
Absolutely, there are no U.S. ambassadors in Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. So there's no Trump, anyway, ambassador, as it were, and hence, whether it was for Anthony Zinni or for Pompeo, there's no follow-up on the ground, which is usually needed for this kind of thing to maintain the pressure, to at least show or keep appearances of persistent diplomatic effort in the region. But I think, despite all of that, Hazem, I would say the following. It seems from the tone today that Qatar has moved on as much as Washington has moved on when it comes to the Gulf crisis, meaning I think just as Qatar left OPEC, I think there's a sense that whatever the Gulf crisis is, and until its neighbors, come down the tree, and as I keep saying all the time, it's very difficult in the Gulf because you have to come down a palm tree, which is double the challenge of coming down any tree. So until they get over their pride, apologize to Qatar for what they've done, and lift the embargo and start a dialogue, Qatar has decided to just move on, as it were, with its relationship with the United States, with its relationship with its neighbors, and with the European community and others around the world. And here the relationship is quite precious, as it were. Huge investments in the United States, $20 billion surplus of trade in favor of the United States. And of course, we have, as Hashim mentioned, the military base and so on and so forth. I think also from the side of Washington, it seems like they've moved on, meaning relations between Washington and Doha no longer have to go through Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, or any other country. They just keep growing. And in fact, I would say the following. Since last January's strategic dialogue between Qatar and the United States, we've moved not just a year, not just a calendar year, we've moved a political diplomatic decade. And hence the confidence of the strengthening of the relationship is really obvious from the 4 agreements signed.
He then moves on to Saudi Arabia, where he's promising to be very frank with Saudi leaders about the investigation into the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was murdered in the consulate in Istanbul. Yes. He's also going to meet with Mohammed bin Salman, we understand, who many believe is the man who was behind the whole thing. So how much confidence do we have that there's going to be an honest conversation there?
Well, look, I don't think many people doubt that Washington knows what went down in Istanbul. And they know, because we've heard so many of them express it, as to who is responsible, who gives the orders in Riyadh, and so on and so forth. But as President Trump says, in his own way, well, look, maybe we will never know, maybe we will know, but the relationship, the economics of the relationship with Saudi Arabia, the strategic aspect of the relationship with Saudi Arabia trumps any ethical, moral, or sideshow diplomatic issues that have to do with any murder, human rights, or the likes. And hence, I think President Trump decided that the relationship with Saudi Arabia will continue regardless. But in the process, the likes of Secretary Pompeo will be putting pressure on the likes of Mohammed bin Salman to come out clean, at least in the sense of putting out a show, right? Not like that meager, secret, show trial that we saw last week, but something more serious to show that Saudi Arabia, if it did not or does not just regret, but actually more than regret the event, that gives enough assurances that what happened in Istanbul will not be repeated. But guess what? Human rights violations continues in Saudi Arabia. It's reported every day, and maybe one young lady leaves the family, leaves the country, and creates such havoc, ends up in Canada. We're probably going to see more of that unless Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi royal family, gets down to business, try to fix the problems that needs to be fixing, and transform the regime. It needs to be transformed. So I think probably behind the scenes, not during a press conference, we might see the United States, the Trump administration in particular, put some pressure on the Saudis in as much as Congress is putting pressure on the Trump administration, in as much as the American public opinion, the American media are putting pressure on the Trump administration.
Good to get your perspective on this, as always. Al Jazeera senior political analyst Marwan Bishara. Thank you.